My talk is titled From Genocide to Global War. It's time to really understand imperialism. It has become easier recently to understand that democracy and human rights are not really the core values of U.S. foreign policy or behavior. When people who protest genocide against Palestinians are denounced as anti-Semitic, it can be considered a learning moment. The question arises, why is this happening and how did we get here? I wrote about this in my new book, A Realistic Path to Peace, From Genocide to Global War, and How We Can Stop It. You can get that here. I'll make it even better than a discount if you push. My friend Danny Haifong says the book is a must-read for anyone wanting to understand how the U.S. is supporting genocide in Palestine and pursuing war with Russia and China. I'll lean on my book to help find root causes for today's current disasters and outrages. I want to thank the Black Alliance for Peace Solidarity Network for inviting me and for showing that it's all connected, from Palestine to Venezuela to Haiti to Africa and to right here in the USA. BAP talks a lot about the ideology of white supremacy, really a mental and social disease masquerading as a way of justifying domination and conquest. Getting back to genocide in Palestine, in my book I write about Zionist apartheid and connect it to apartheid in South Africa, which was defeated back in the 1980s through a massive BDS campaign, boycott, divest, and sanction, led by the Black liberation and civil rights movements and many other progressive forces here and around the world. It's an advantage of being old that I was there. I was involved. A key parallel between then and now is how the official U.S. government position was forced to change back then and how we're trying to make that happen again. Ronald Reagan, the U.S. president in the 1980s, called Nelson Mandela a terrorist and lavished U.S. support on the super racist South African apartheid rulers, encouraging U.S. big business to do the same, just like against Palestine. The terrorist label was used back then to smear the leaders of the African liberation movement, exactly the same as it's used against the Palestinian liberation movement today. Then and now, it's a convenient way to condemn the fight against racism and for independence and freedom as basically just a violation of law and order. That is the racist status quo, which is, of course, bolstered by state terrorism that kills and strangles its victims in the millions. South Africa was invaded a few centuries ago during the period of the European conquest. It was the dawn of the age of colonialism, which was glorified as the white man's burden by the English and as a civilizing mission by the French. In the U.S., it was called manifest destiny. A working definition of manifest destiny is that European settlers were sent from heaven to civilize inferior people, and if they resist, heaven's hosts are justified to subdue them. The American settlers waged so-called Indian wars to expand this country from the Atlantic to the Pacific and dragged millions of people from Africa in chains to work in the cotton fields of the South. The human trafficking of Africans, along with the European theft of gold, silver, and other resources in the Americas, led to the Industrial Revolution. The Europeans, mainly the British, but also the French, Dutch, and Germans, pressed their advantage to colonize Africa and Asia and to invade and occupy China. Meanwhile, the U.S. settlers completed their western expansion by taking over half of Mexico in the mid-19th century, and they used the Monroe Doctrine, declared back in 1823, to claim control of the rest of the Americas. It's important to know Zionism is not a religion, but an ethno-political white supremacist ideology that developed in the 19th century. Its colonizing effort in Palestine began at the end of World War I in 1917 after the British Empire defeated the Ottoman Empire led by Turkey. The letter formalizing the deal from British Foreign Minister Lord Balfour to Zionist leader Lord Rothschild stipulated that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, end quote. But the State of Israel, founded after the end of World War II, launched a settler colonialist project, driving out the Palestinians and taking over their lands. It has continued this for 75 years. Terrorism is a good name for it. Also in 1917, Lenin's landmark book, Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, was published just before the Russian Revolution, which really heralded the end of the colonialist pillage of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The Europeans and North Americans had invaded and pillaged the world's majority, getting enormously rich from their resources and exploiting their people. That's imperialism. They took the African people as slaves, using them to turn their lands, as well as the lands of the Americas, into sources of massive profit and deep misery for the native people. The 20th century was largely a decades-long battle over the end of colonialism, but also its transformation into modern 20th century imperialism. The capitalist leaders of the US and Europe fought to stop the spread of capitalism, communism, and socialism, which they recognized as the mortal enemies of free enterprise, also known as imperialism. They had enriched themselves on the enormous wealth of their colonies, human flesh and labor, gold, silver, sugar, coffee, rubber, and cotton, and with the dawn of the industrial age and motor transport, oil, the black gold that became the cornerstone and controlling factor of 20th century imperialism. The end of World War II was the beginning of the end of the colonial era, which had lasted several centuries. First the Vietnamese, then the Algerians, and then pretty much all the former colonies of Africa and the Caribbean launched fights for independence. The U.S. had emerged from World War II as the big winner and reorganized the world for imperialist domination. It established the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, as well as NATO and other structures, to function as a rules-based order for its domination. We all know about rules-based order thanks to Secretary of State Blinken. When he was a senator back in the 1980s, Joe Biden famously declared that Israel was like an unsinkable aircraft carrier to protect U.S. control of Middle East oil. It was also the guardian of the strategic Suez Canal, through which a very large portion of world trade passes. During the disastrous U.S. war in Vietnam, which itself was a desperate fight against the communist peril posed by the USSR and Red China, some imperialist voices claimed that Vietnam was the wrong place to defend the free enterprise world. They wanted to refocus on the black gold. They had already engineered a coup d'etat and fake revolution in Iran back in 1953 to assure their control of its massive oil resources. That led to 25 years of dictatorship under the Shah of Iran. Meanwhile, and it's good background for what we're looking at today as we appear to be tottering on the brink of regional war, if not global war. Meanwhile, they sponsored the Zionist project of occupying a land without a people for a people without land, as they said. They supported Israel's Nakba to kill or remove close to 1 million Palestinians, as well as wars against the nearby Arab countries, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, they launched a project of the New American Century, also known as the End of History, in which the U.S. would be the sole superpower, stamping out rivals wherever they might emerge. This led to endless war, as George Bush's War Secretary Donald Rumsfeld delicately called it. The decades-long invasions and occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan, the breakup of Yugoslavia, which had been the last vestige of socialism in Europe, the bombing of Libya and the murder of its leader Gaddafi, who had the temerity to call for an African currency. By killing Gaddafi, the neocons hoped to fortify their incursions in Africa. Unfortunately for them, The plan has backfired. Now, a large swath of countries in the Sahel region are breaking free from U.S. and French neocolonialism. These and other African countries have been receiving help from both China and Russia, which promises to help them break out of the ravages of imperialist debt and poverty. It's worth mentioning as a side note, as my friend mentioned, that the Israelis have very, very much been the attack dog of U.S. imperialism, especially in East and Central Africa, focusing on both the Sudan and the Congo, where literally millions of people have been killed, and it continues today. The U.S. and NATO also took advantage of the Soviet collapse to try and colonize Russia, but that effort failed after Vladimir Putin became Russia's president at the end of the 1990s. The neocons in D.C. have never forgiven Putin for stopping the massive sell-off of state resources following the collapse of Soviet socialism. They demonize him the same way they did Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq. They even sponsored a fascist takeover in Ukraine back in 2014, hoping to get Ukraine into NATO and use it as a battering ram against Russia. That ongoing saga is documented in my book, including the plan to slice up Russia into several sections to make it easier to dominate. So far, this plan has backfired badly and now threatens to bring on World War III. All this followed the decades of counter-revolutionary U.S. efforts across the globe to stop the collapse of its empire. Danny Haifong, my friend, highlights the role of American exceptionalism in this fight. He and his co-authors show how the dominant narratives of American exceptionalism and innocence cause many Americans to forget, distort, or excuse the crimes of the nation. They ask, why does the U.S. military have free rein to dictate how other nations conduct themselves while other countries aren't allowed to critique the U.S. for the very same or worse actions? And if the U.S. really cared about protecting our freedom, why is nothing done to alleviate the declining living standards of ordinary Americans? This excellent book about American exceptionalism explains that the ideologies of American exceptionalism and innocence have inoculated the U.S. population from making the connection between the death imposed by modern-day U.S. capitalism at home and the misery the U.S. military reigns on nations abroad. The working-class soldiers who are pushed by the poverty draft to join the military are constantly thanked for their service, while the victims of war are stripped of their humanity. Wars are effectively sanitized as heroic operations that defend the freedom and democracy of all. Soldiers are celebrated for supposedly protecting the interests of Americans from the inferior nations and peoples seeking to harm them, not seeking to be liberated. Meanwhile, inferiority has been a mark placed on communists, nationalists, and most recently, terrorists to justify the plunder, power, and profit derived from U.S. military expansionism. U.S. and Israeli troops represent whiteness in the form of heroism as opposed to the threat posed by dark nations and people. All this is fortified by a state of exception for high-ranking officials who are privy to state secrets, who decide what the public may and may not know, and who plan and authorize covert operations, foreign and domestic surveillance, and other espionage and intelligence activities. This elite polices, largely in secret, the political class and the mass public. They serve to allow the state to overcome three potential impediments to the exigencies of empire, namely the U.S. moral code, global meta-norms, and the rule of law. Exceptionism, the institutionalized suspension of legal restraints, protects them from facing legal consequences stemming from their illicit clandestine activities. We all remember, I think, the recent court action taken by a number of Palestinians and North American residents in San Francisco against the illegal U.S. government backing of genocide against Palestinians, which, of course, violated and continues to violate numerous U.S. laws and treaties. And it's interesting that the judge acknowledged the rightness of the claims of the plaintiffs, just said that under the current arrangement of U.S. law and power, he didn't have jurisdiction. Same thing happened during the U.S. war in Vietnam. The state of exception seals the legitimacy or illegitimacy of the modern state's monopoly on violence, like protection rackets, but on a global scale. The founding fathers of the U.S. empire made vast fortunes in the opium trade, in alliance with the British, who launched the Opium War against China in the mid-19th century, leading to an open door policy designed for the emerging U.S. empire to stand shoulder to shoulder with Imperial Britain, France, and Germany in dominating China for a century of humiliation. Now they're upset at China's fabulous success at standing up on its own and helping other countries get out of the imperialist stranglehold. Forgive me for rattling on. This will end soon. In 1962, President Kennedy reacted to the Cuban Missile Crisis, calling for a strategy of peace in a speech on June 10, 1963, which caused alarm on the right and among hawks in the military and CIA. After Kennedy was gone, the CIA under President Johnson would reverse several Kennedy-era policies in several third world countries, most notably Brazil, Congo, and Indonesia. In Brazil, a U.S.-backed military coup overthrew a progressive government and installed a military regime aligned to U.S. interests, which lasted 21 years until 1985. Meanwhile, in 1973, the U.S. helped overthrow Salvador Allende's Popular Unity government in Chile. This is just a rundown of some of the record of actions of U.S. imperialism. The U.S. fostered a dirty war against Argentina's left in the mid-1970s as part of Operation Condor, which the CIA described as a cooperative effort by the intelligence and security forces of several South American countries to combat terrorism and subversion. The operation included Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, Brazil, Ecuador, and Peru. The results were more than 50,000 people killed, 30,000 disappeared, and 400,000 arrested and imprisoned. In Guatemala, after the U.S. toppled a progressive president in 1954, 200,000 mostly Mayan people were killed in the 36 years long Guatemalan Civil War by death squads trained here in the United States. In neighboring El Salvador, at least 75,000 civilians were killed over the course of 12 years by U.S.-trained death squads opposed by the FMLN, the Frente Martí Liberación Nacional. The Sandinistas in Nicaragua fought successfully to prevent the same fate at the hands of Reagan's Contras, whom he called freedom fighters. I was in Nicaragua for 3 years and was able to witness that with my own eyes. In 1965, the U.S. CIA helped the Indonesian military kill more than 1 million innocent civilians in order to stop Indonesia from getting closer to China. This largely unpublicized slaughter inspired copycat terror programs in other countries. It served as a model for CIA's secret interventions elsewhere. In the Congo, Africa's second largest country geographically with a population of more than 100 million, the CIA was involved in the 1961 assassination of Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba and helped foster a 4-year civil war, killing hundreds of thousands. Lumumba's followers founded a state, the People's Republic of Congo, with its capital in the northeastern city of Stanleyville, supported by the Soviet Union and China, as well as Tanzania and Cuba. Che Guevara led a group of 100 Cuban advisors there. The CIA supported the government of Prime Minister Joseph Mobutu, who seized power and set up his own state of exception in 1965, renaming the country Zaire with U.S. backing. Mobutu was deposed in 1997 in an insurrection led by the Lumumbist forces of Laurent Désiré Kabila, who became president of the restored Democratic Republic of Congo. Since then, Congo has been a scene of ongoing struggle between left and right that continues to this present day. Meanwhile, we're going to see assassinations in various places that make it easier to understand the recent assassinations of leaders of both Hamas and the liberation movement in Lebanon. Across the rest of Latin America and Africa, there were assassination attempts and tragic deaths of liberation fighters. Amilcar Cabral of Guinea-Bissau was assassinated in 1973 at the age of 48 by Portugal's political police. Eduardo Mondlane, president of Mozambique's Frelimo, was killed by a letter bomb in 1969. Mondlane's successor, Samora Machel, died in a mysterious airplane crash in 1986 near the South African border. Both Kwame Nkrumah, president of Ghana, and Agostinho Neto, founder of the MPLA and president of Angola, died relatively young of pancreatic cancer. Fidel Castro has the distinction of surviving countless CIA assassination attempts. Venezuelan leader Hugo Chavez was not so fortunate. Chavez himself speculated that he had been poisoned. His successor, Nicolas Maduro, called it an assassination. Chinese Foreign Minister Zhou Enlai was nearly assassinated when he was en route to the Bandung Conference of Non-Aligned Nations in 1955. Recently, the U.S. has sponsored coups d'etat in both Bolivia and Peru, and backed soft coups in both Ecuador and Argentina. They try to never let real independence take root in the lands of the Monroe Doctrine. After Venezuela's recent elections in which President Maduro won a third term as president, the U.S. has launched a campaign to discredit the vote as fraudulent, hoping to stop Venezuela's drive to establish and defend 20th century socialism. The U.S. has tried and failed with several coup attempts and nearly succeeded in strangling Venezuela with sanctions that cut off 99% of its oil trade, leading to hyperinflation that caused the deaths of thousands of Venezuelans. It was an echo of the blockade of Cuba ever since 1962 and the Contra War against Nicaragua during the 1980s, followed by the current campaign to label the Sandinistas as a threat to U.S. national security. At Nicaragua's recent 45th anniversary celebration of its 1979 revolution, the legendary Palestinian terrorist Leila Khaled was the guest of honor. Back in 1970, she joined Sandinista fighter Patrick Arguello to hijack a plane to draw attention to the illegal Zionist occupation of Palestine. This was a testament to the enduring alliance between the Sandinistas and the Palestinian Liberation Movement. Nicaragua recently joined South Africa's case, accusing Israel of genocide, and earlier launched its own case against Germany for supporting Israeli genocide. So Palestine's current fight against Zionism can be seen as part of the long-term struggle against U.S. imperialism, which has lasted for more than a century. Even though that struggle has brought the world to the brink of global war, it is also leading to defeat, not only for the Zionist project, but also for the whole imperialist project globally. It's early to tell if the Palestinians and their allies around the region and across the globe can finally end Zionist terrorism and realize their self-determination. But Zionism and imperialism are more isolated and exposed globally than ever before. The world might be on the brink of a new non-imperialist order. The rule of the almighty dollar and of U.S. military threats and occupation could actually be coming to an end. If that happens, the people of the world will celebrate together with the heroic, long-suffering people of Palestine. Thank you.